There is a bizarre place in the remote Western Sahara Desert called the Richat structure. And if you've never seen or heard of this place before, you are in for something truly fascinating. Some people refer to it as the Eye of the Sahara or the Eye of Africa. And when you see it from space, it's not hard to understand why. I mean, it really does look like an eye. And people are absolutely stunned when they see it for the first time. Between its unusual symmetrical shape, color, and immense size, it takes many people by curious surprise as they wonder not only what this thing is, but how did they go their whole life without seeing or hearing about it before. However, the fascination of this place goes far beyond its intriguing shape and design. 2 years ago, I made 3 videos where I shared more than a dozen remarkable similarities between this structure to that of Plato's description of the legendary lost ancient city of Atlantis. And these similarities are so astounding that the topic of Atlantis and the Richat structure quickly became one of the most discussed and hotly debated topics involving lost ancient human civilizations, as tabloid news outlets from around the world picked up on the story, and the videos ignited thought-provoking conversation as to whether or not it's possible that the lost city of Atlantis actually existed, and if so, had it been hiding in plain sight in the remote, desolate Mauritanian desert of Africa for thousands of years. But even for most people, when they hear the words Lost City of Atlantis, most would usually think of some animated Disney movie about a fictional underwater city, or perhaps some beach resort in the Bahamas. However, a little known fact is that the true origins of the tale of Atlantis originates from the ancient Egyptians, as they had carved in stone that there were survivors of Atlantis, which were said to be a sophisticated civilization that existed some 12,000 years ago. That was until their island was obliterated by a cataclysm, and the survivors of Atlantis found their way to the Nile Delta region to start all over again as colonizers. And I'll be retouching on many of those similarities again in this video, as incredible new information has come to light, and it is now time to revisit this topic again. You see, the interest in the Eye of the Sahara is not just limited to us here chatting about it over the internet, because it turns out that the CIA has also had quite an interest in this place as well, and it goes back decades. So get this, there are declassified CIA documents on the Richat structure, the Eye of the Sahara. That's right, and I've seen the released files with my own eyes, and I'm going to share them with you here as well. And I have to say that this stuff is beyond interesting. However, let me just say that there's nothing in these declassified files that say anything about Atlantis or lost ancient civilizations. What they do say is quite interesting. However, what these files do not say, the parts that are redacted and still classified, is really going to get you thinking. So where do I begin? Well, it turns out in 1967, the CIA conducted a secret mission where they sent military aircraft to conduct covert surveillance and scientific experiments on about a dozen different sites from around the world to study for geomagnetic anomalies. And of the few places in the world that they chose to study on this top secret mission, the mysterious Eye of the Sahara just so happened to be one of them. And like I said, the stated purpose of studying these sites was for identifying geomagnetic anomalies, which, if you're not familiar, the Earth's geomagnetic field is what shields us from the vastness of space, which, when you think about it, is incredible. I mean, it allows our planet to travel through the cosmos at incredible speeds, all while protected from the vacuum of space as we live comfortably and safely within a seemingly invisible shield that's in the shape of a bubble. So now that this secret mission is declassified, what were the results of that mission and the scientific experiments? Well, we don't know, because that part is still classified, as there is nothing in these release files that say anything about what the findings of their scientific study were related to geomagnetic anomalies or their covert surveillance, which is utterly weird when you consider that this was back in 1967, 54 years ago from 2021, and we still don't get to know what the results of their findings were. So yeah, is it just me or is that strangely interesting? But here's the thing, that is just the beginning of where things start to get weird. In fact, that is probably the least interesting part of these declassified files. Now, before I share that next part, I must first revisit a few of the remarkable similarities between the Eye of the Sahara to that of the tale of Atlantis, so that way we can all truly appreciate just how interesting / bizarre all of this actually is. As I discussed in my previous videos, the story of Atlantis originates from the ancient Egyptians, and they had described an empire named Atlantis, which consisted of 10 kingdoms, and the capital of Atlantis was on an island that consisted of 3 rings of water and 2 of land, which, of course, when we look at the Richat structure, you see that it would precisely match that specific detail of 3 rings of water and 2 of land. And not only that, it was said to open to the sea at the south, which is exactly what you see here at the Richat. In fact, you can literally see the striations in the sand where water once flowed through it. But not only that, those white blemishes are indeed salt. An unbelievably significant detail which I'll discuss more of in a moment. But Atlantis was also said to have mountains to the north, mountains that were said to have rivers run through them, which, yes, there are mountains with evidence of ancient water flow north of the Richat. Atlantis was also said to be surrounded by a large plain, which also exists for hundreds of miles on both sides of the Richat structure. Another striking similarity is that Atlantis was said to consist of black, red, and white colored stone, which is incredibly interesting when you see all the stones of that color in and around the region of the Richat. There was also said to be an abundance of elephants, and elephants live in Mauritania today and have for thousands of years. In fact, there's an even ancient cave art depicting elephants not far from the Richat. And Atlantis was also said to have an abundance of exotic fruit and vegetables, which makes the case for it being in North Africa even more compelling, considering that we now know that the Sahara Desert didn't even exist until somewhere around 11,600 years ago, where it went from green to desert in practically an instant. But many people are not aware of this incredible fact that the Sahara had previously been a lush green tropical paradise at the same time that Atlantis was said to exist. In fact, it was said to be made up of the largest freshwater lakes and rivers ever known to exist anywhere on Earth, which of course would support that the region of the Western Sahara would have naturally growing fruits and vegetables. But alleged vegetation that no longer exists in this region aside, Atlantis was said to have an abundance of metals, including iron, copper, and gold. Well, it turns out that Mauritania's most common exports today include iron, copper, and gold. But the similarities do not end here. You see, Atlantis was said to be created by the god Poseidon, and Poseidon had 10 children that came from 5 sets of male twins. And each of these 10 children would individually be ruler of the 10 kingdoms that made up the empire of Atlantis. And the firstborn would rule the capital, and his name was Atlas. So does anyone want to guess who the name of the first king of Mauritania was? King Atlas, who ruled over the Maori people, which is why the land is called Mauritania today. And not only that, the vast mountain region located north of the Richat just so happens to be named the Atlas Mountains. What a coincidence. Now, another incredible detail involves this map. Herodotus is considered by many to be the father of history due to his extensive historical documentation. In fact, we wouldn't even know about the Greco-Persian Wars if it wasn't for him. And some 2,500 years ago, he made a written detailed account of the known world at that time. However, he himself did not draw out this map. Others, and I do not know who or when, read through his various works and annotated that the people of Atlantis lived in this region you see here, which just so happens to be the same general location of the Richat structure. What are the odds of that? The very same place that has a highly unusual land feature that consists of symmetrical rings. Now, the similarities do not even end here. Go watch my 3 other videos on this topic, because for the sake of brevity in this video, I want to share new information that has come to light. But just to sum up where we're at so far, the most striking comparisons include that the Richat would have 3 rings of water and 2 of land, an opening to the sea at the south, mountains to the north with evidence of water erosion, black, red, and white colored stones, an abundance of iron, copper, and gold, a vast plain surrounding on both sides. Elephants existed in this area, and not only that, evidence of profound amounts of vegetation existing at the same place and at the same time of when Atlantis was said to exist. Now, these similarities are pretty remarkable. However, that does not necessarily prove that this is the long-lost location of Atlantis. In fact, there are many different counter-arguments on why this could not be the site, which I'll be discussing in detail later in the video. But let me first circle back to the declassified files on the Eye of the Sahara. Like I mentioned, these files do not say anything about Atlantis or lost ancient civilizations, nor do they include the very results of the scientific study for geomagnetic anomalies, which is so weird considering, again, it's 54 years later, and we're still not allowed to know, because here's what I consider to be the weirdest part of all, which involves the entire context of this study itself. Quote, "While the scientific aspects of this survey are totally unclassified and available to the worldwide scientific community, blank, redacted, not unclassified, as in still classified 54 years later in 2021. Let me read that again. While the scientific aspects of this survey are totally unclassified and available to the worldwide scientific community, nothing. What did the rest of this half page that is now whited out, redacted, and even which continues on to a small portion on the next page, what did all of this say? It's quite literally the entire context of the mission itself, and yet it's still classified. They purposely removed it decades later. So ask yourself, 1, why did they end up not including the results of their findings within the released declassified files, despite the fact that they said that they would? 2, why did they classify the mission itself when they had also first said that it wasn't going to be? And 3, why is this giant portion redacted from the declassified files themselves? Like I said at the beginning of this video, that is strangely interesting, isn't it? But let me be clear, I am not suggesting that these files had anything to do with Atlantis. But at the same time, I do find it interesting in that Atlantis was said to have special geologic properties to it. For example, the center island of the capital was said to have 2 springs of fresh water, one of cold, the other warm, and that in itself would be geologically unique. So the fact that there was something about this site that led to a top secret study for geomagnetic properties makes me wonder, particularly when you realize that most of it is still classified in so many decades later. And especially when you consider that this site just so happens to have so many uncanny similarities to the description of Atlantis, as I just shared. But with all of that said, do you guys want to hear some new information that I've learned that makes this location even more compelling? So, despite the striking similarities at the Richat in comparison to Atlantis, many people still have doubts that the Eye could even possibly be the location, as the structure today is more than 1,200 feet above sea level. So, how could this place be the location of an island that once met the ocean? Well, notice the various areas of white coloration that you see not only from the air, but from satellite imagery as well. These white blemishes are indeed salt. You can even go there and taste it right off the ground yourself, as my journalist friend Josh Sigurdsson did, and what an insanely epic trip he had to this site. In fact, he almost died, and I encourage all of you to go and watch his video on BitChute. But something many people do not know is that this region has an abundance of salt at surface level. In fact, you can read articles about the salt caravans that exist in Mauritania today. This is something that is widely documented yet little known. This salt came from the ocean, and you can literally see it in the exact areas where cataclysmic flooding once flowed through here, as you can see from satellite imagery. And even the areas of the lowest elevation within the Richat are the areas with the most salt, making it even more evident that salt water once consumed and settled within this structure. And you'll also see it noticeably at the southern entrance, respectively. It's worth noting that the highly respected Randall Carlson himself has analyzed this site and stated that it is a location of cataclysmic water erosion. He actually went into detail about this on his own YouTube channel, and I highly recommend you check it out, and I'll leave a link in the description down below. But let me play a couple short clips so you can hear it directly from him.
Okay. And in fact, I'll show you in a minute, it looks like there was evidence for extreme floods over this whole landscape. You can see incised by erosion. This is obviously water erosion here.
And he goes on to make the comparison of the massive recessional cataracts found at Dry Falls in Washington State, which were caused by cataclysmic flooding at the end of the last ice age. Well, it turns out that the Richat itself has the same type of water erosion as well, as he points out here.
Which is very interesting. You see what actually looks like recessional cataracts.
Yeah.
So the stripping and exposure of this feature may have involved catastrophism.
Now, hold on to that thought, because he goes on to point out that you can even see the landmark water ripples created from immense levels of water flow all around the Richat, which matches the landmark ripples observed in the northwestern United States in the same exact region as the Dry Falls recessional cataracts as I just shared. The pictures you see here are at the Missoula floodplains in Washington State and Montana, which Randall Carlson was discussing. And those massive ripples are hundreds of feet wide and can only be appreciated from the air as they are that big, which further illustrates the level of cataclysmic flooding this area once endured some 12,000 years ago. And real quick, just for frame of reference, compare the small ripples we've all seen at the beach. And in fact, just the other day I had a great synchronicity while I was walking my dog along a canal and noticed the same small sand ripples at the bottom. So now listen to what Mr. Carlson shares with us about the Richat.
Look right here. You see the current ripples? Now there's sand between them, but if these are similar to the current giant current ripples we see out in Washington and Montana, and notice the texture here, passing over the region out to sea right here. And if we zoom in,
okay.
Yeah, so this is southwest of the actual structure. So what it appears to me is sometime you had tremendous processes at work here. Oh yeah, look at this, a beautiful, oh man, there it is.
Wow.
There it is. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Intense.
Now, something that Randall makes no mention of is the existing salt found all around this area, including the images he shares on screen, as you can observe throughout this image in the area, all those white blemishes. We can even reference the nearby Tashit, Mauritania salt caravans I shared a few moments ago. All of those white blemishes are surface level salt, and I'd be very curious to hear what Randall Carlson's thoughts are on this important detail. Again, this is how you know the Richat was consumed by the ocean within the last 12,000 years by some unknown cataclysmic flooding event, because let's not forget that the latest scientific studies have proven that the Sahara Desert was a lush green tropical paradise up until around 11,600 or so years ago, which is when it started to become the vast desert we all know today. And the sands of the Sahara are known to have come from the ocean after this transition to the desert happened, and the fact that the sand has salt on top of it is how you know that the ocean flooded over this region far more recently than most realize. You see, most have assumed that the last time North Africa was under the ocean was between 50 and 66 million years ago. And that was the time of the Trans-Saharan Seaway. But notice that this seaway does not annotate it going over the area of the Richat structure. Rather, it goes south. Yet, clearly, the same landmark evidence of cataclysmic flooding did flow over the Richat, which is evident, and also confirmed by experts such as Carlson himself, which indicates that something else, something separate, happened over this area far more recently. And the fact that these landmark water ripples still exist in the same fashion as the identical ripples in Washington State only further adds to the corresponding evidence that something happened over the Richat at that same period of time. And these features of water erosion would have surely been eroded long ago, especially when we consider that the Sahara is confirmed to transition back and forth from lush green jungle to desert every 20,000 years. And that's according to a study by MIT, by the way. But that by itself would constantly be changing the surface of this region. I mean, think about that. With all the constant changes we now know that the Sahara endures, to even suggest that the area around the Richat hasn't changed in the last 50 to 66 million years ago is basically like saying that nothing has changed here since back of the time of the dinosaurs, which of course would make no sense. And to be fair, nobody is actually suggesting that directly. However, that would have to be the case if what they were saying were correct, and it obviously isn't. There's obviously more to the story, as clearly something happened to North Africa far more recently. And when we discuss seismic flooding 11,600 years ago, let's compare that to the time frame to other separate declassified CIA documents that I also discussed in a different video a couple years ago. There is a book called The Adam and Eve Story, which was discussed in a secret CIA meeting some 50 years ago, and the book itself was not classified, as some have thought, but the reason why this book was discussed in a CIA meeting in the first place is still classified. But in that book, the author, Chan Thomas, described events that happen routinely on Earth that cause biblical levels of ocean flooding over entire continents. And look at the date on that. Identical to the 11,600 year date I've just been discussing, and keep in mind this book was written 50 plus years ago, so where it says 11,550 years ago is actually the same date today. But I mean, come on, what are the odds of that? The same date described continental flooding, and here we have the Sahara Desert that looks like it was obliterated by a continental-sized flood. And if you haven't watched my video on that, go check it out, as it's becoming increasingly clear that there is a connection to what we're seeing at the Richat and North Africa. And that's not all that's to be said about the 11,600 year date, as it is the same exact date that Atlantis was said to have been destroyed, as Solon went to Egypt in 600 BC and was told that Atlantis had been destroyed precisely 9,000 years earlier. Well, 600 BC is 2,600 years ago from today, and then add the 9,000 years on top of it, and it equates to precisely 11,600 years ago. That is far too precise to be a coincidence, and if you ask me, it is legitimate evidence that Atlantis actually existed. But if that's not overwhelming enough, the 11,600 year date is also the same exact timing of the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe that occurred 11,600 years ago and instigated what is referred to as Meltwater Pulse 1b. There was a sudden and rapid rise in global sea levels at the end of the last ice age, and again 11,600 years ago. All of the dots connect here, and it's apparent for all who have eyes to see. Something really bad happened on Earth at that period of time, and it's weird that this isn't discussed in more headline news. But now going back to the discussion of the Richat being the location of Atlantis, many will say that since it's currently more than 1,200 feet above sea level and that it's not an island and that there are no remnants of destroyed structures here, how could it possibly be the location of Atlantis? Well, this is actually very easy to explain, and it's apparent that the region of Northwest Africa has lifted. The existing salt is there. The ocean did indeed go over it. It's funny how people will claim that the Richat could not have been at sea level, yet they never mention the existing salt all around the area, including within the Richat. But when we consider that the whole region is known for its volcanic activity, including the various island chains off the west coast of Africa, and the massive Atlas mountain chain located north of the Richat, and the very fact that the Richat structure itself is considered to be the result of repeated volcanic activity, as it was said to have been lifted and collapsed multiple times over, thus creating the ring structure we see today. It's more than appropriate to assume that the surrounding area has subsequently been lifted as well, because that's exactly what volcanic activity does. It lifts the ground in the surrounding area, and most people understand this, but to paint you a picture of what's possible, let's just consider the extraordinary case of the Paracutan volcano in Mexico. On February 20th, 1943, a volcano suddenly started to develop on a farmer's field, and the cone rose to nearly 1,500 feet or 450 meters from its base in the very first year. So the fact that the Richat is less than 1,300 feet above sea level is completely feasible to have been lifted over the course of some 12,000 years, even when we consider the lower global sea levels at that time. Again, I don't know what happened to North Africa 11 to 12,000 years ago, nor do I know what happened there in the 10,000 years since. But the very fact that the sand is there and the salt is on top of it says it all. But people will say, if this was indeed the location of Atlantis, then where are the artifacts and remnants of destroyed buildings? Well, considering that the massive flooding stripped away the bedrock itself, that means that everything that would have been built above it would have been swept away along with that bedrock that once sat on top of. So here's a short clip of Mr. Carlson addressing this.
It does appear that there were extreme floods and fluvial erosion over the plateau that would have been ultimately responsible for exposing the core of this unique structure that would have been buried beneath, many hundreds of feet, maybe thousands of feet of bedrock at one time.
Clearly, if flooding occurred that was strong enough to strip bedrock, you're not going to remove the bedrock without removing everything else that was on top of it. It's the same concept of the so-called tablecloth trick, except that that trick obviously wouldn't work in the case of catastrophic flooding. So if we're talking about removing hundreds and possibly even thousands of feet of bedrock, there would be no structures left to be found. In fact, it would have been swept away into the Atlantic Ocean, which plummets to depths exceeding 11,000 feet, or more than 3,400 meters, not far off the coast. Even the shallow-looking areas you see here are at depths of more than 1,000 feet, practically instantly off the coast of Africa. So any stone block from buildings would have been pummeled to pebbles long before then, and making it highly unlikely for anything to ever be found. But still, who knows what could be laying at unknown depths under the dirt in the area between the Richat and the Atlantic Ocean. But that aside, here's another interesting point to be made. People will say that since the Richat is not an island, and since it's not located west of the Pillars of Hercules or the Straits of Gibraltar, it could not be the location of Atlantis. However, keep in mind that the empire of Atlantis was made up of 10 kingdoms. For example, I shared that Atlas was the firstborn and was ruler of the capital, but Gades was the second-born, and there is a region in southern Spain just outside the Straits of Gibraltar that once had that exact same name. What are the odds? I would argue that this whole region was the area where we would find the 10 kingdoms that make up Atlantis. I simply suggest that the Richat would be the most likely location for the capital. And if that's the case, the locations of the other 9 kingdoms would surely be within this region. And I must mention that Randall Carlson puts forth an excellent argument for considering the Azores, which is an island chain found directly west of the Straits. However, many people are looking for an island that's now at the bottom of the ocean. However, we must consider that this is a 12,000-year-old story that was passed down by numerous people in multiple different languages. And so now, here is one huge detail that is either unknown or not shared by researchers, which is that the ancient Greek word that was used by Plato to describe island was the word Nessos. Well, you might be quite surprised to know that the word Nessos actually had 5 meanings to the ancient Greeks, including the words island, promontory, peninsula, coast, and even land within a continent that is surrounded by lakes, rivers, or streams. My goodness, that certainly qualifies the Richat structure. People in modern times allow themselves to get caught up by the word island without thoroughly researching the history of its translation. And another profound detail why we should not be looking for Atlantis at the bottom of the ocean is because when you specifically read what Plato actually wrote in describing Atlantis' final resting place, he states, quote, "And the island of Atlantis was similarly swallowed up by the sea and vanished. This is why the sea in that area is to this day impassable to navigation, which is hindered by mud just below the surface, the remains of the sunken island." That in no way describes an island that sank to the bottom of the ocean. Furthermore, if you go to the Temple of Horus in Edfu, Egypt today, the ancients carved in stone that they had came from the primeval ones, who were survivors of an island that was destroyed in a cataclysm, and they specifically stated that all that was left of that land were the reeds, which is grass, that was still penetrating through the water where it had been submerged. meaning that it was at such shallow depths that the grass could still be seen. Even Graham Hancock has discussed this in detail in lectures as well as in his book, Magician of the Gods, which I highly recommend. But the point is that the destroyed capital is not at the bottom of the ocean, and it was never said to be. Unfortunately, many researchers and scholars in modern times have deviated from the actual wording of Plato and did not go to the extent to thoroughly research the ancient translations of his specific wording. Hence why, despite the extensive underwater searching for Atlantis over the past several decades has led to nothing. But an impassable barrier of mud would be exactly what we could see within the hundreds of miles of dirt found between the Richat and the Atlantic Ocean. We must consider the significance of that this is a 12,000-year-old story and that lost in translation is a very real thing. In fact, I would argue that there is a 0% chance that every single part of what Plato wrote could be 100% accurate. In fact, Plato specifically told us that in the Critias. Quote, "I have described the city and the environs of the ancient palace nearly, so not perfectly, in the words of Solon," and here's the big part, "and now I must endeavor to represent to you the nature and arrangement of the rest of the land." That's straight from the Critias itself, which, by the way, is an uncompleted book that just cuts off in the middle and the rest is missing. So that's a mystery in itself, but we don't even have the entire dialogue of what he said about Atlantis. But here, Plato is literally telling you that he either can't read, translate, or decipher various parts of Solon's notes. Yet, some people have chosen to take his words completely at face value, and let's not forget, guys, that Solon lived 200 years before Plato. Think about how many words have changed in your own language within the last couple hundred years. I mean, heck, if I go and read notes from the founding fathers of the United States in the 17 and 1800s, go read that stuff and look at how many words have changed you don't understand, or they say things that are just totally different than today. So again, considering this is a 12,000-year-old story, passed through numerous languages, or at least a few languages over that period of time, lost in translation is just a real thing. But to make one last point on this, to nail the coffin on the point that I'm making here, is that consider that according to the Math Association of America, scholars disagree greatly on the length of the ancient Greek measurement of the stade, and go on to say that there are at least 6 different variations of the ancient Greek stade measurement. Again, this is what lost in translation looks like. We can't even conclude measurements details of 4,000 years ago, so why on earth would people assume that a 12,000-year-old story that's been passed through multiple languages would be totally correct? All of this is even more reason to not bother debating the described measurements of Atlantis. In fact, I'm quite amazed that people have used this as an argument against the Richat, as they completely ignore the scientific fact that the bedrock that makes up the Richat itself was stripped by cataclysmic flooding. Consider that the hills, which make up the rings of the Richat, would be thinner at the top, as it's like a hill, and we all know how hills work, and it's wider at the bottom. But now that we've heard and know that the flooding has stripped the bedrock off the top, that throws off the measurements from when it was covered with water. It would have been wider at the bottom, but that's not the part they'd be measuring. They'd be measuring the point of that's above the water. Do you see what I'm saying? Listen to this clip by Randall Carlson that explains the point I'm trying to make here involving the bedrock being stripped away.
To me, then, what that suggests is that you had this fluvial event or events that stripped away the overlying layers of rock to expose this core of this thing, which is, again, if you picture that it domes up, the dome essentially, picture a large pimple, right? And then if you shear the top of it off, what's going to happen is you're going to see a ringed structure. Does that make sense?
Now, he was not describing that in regards to the measurements of Atlantis, but it's a crucial point in explaining that the measurements would have to be off, knowing that the bedrock was obliterated away. So for the several reasons I just mentioned above, I do not think that the size of Atlantis is something that can be accurately or even appropriately debated. But lastly, modern-day naysayers won't even debate any of the amazing details discussed in this video, as they simply say that Plato made up the whole thing. They mention that some of his works were allegorical fiction, and thus, for some bizarre reason, they basically claim that the story of Atlantis must be fiction as well, despite the fact that Plato very specifically describes that it was indeed true. But Many modern scholars will cite the example of Plato's allegory of a cave, which, as you may notice, literally has the word allegory in the title itself. I mean, Plato's telling us it's fiction, whereas he did not say that about Atlantis. And what's so ironic about this is that Plato is literally describing the same mentality of the modern day naysayers. I mean, it's kind of hilarious, which is why I created an advanced math formula to articulate that, as you can see here. Ha, ha, ha. Well, okay, so this has gone a bit long, so I'm going to wrap it up. And there's just so much more to be said, so this will not be my last video on this topic. But leave a comment and share what your thoughts are on all of this. I mean, going back to the declassified files, why is some of that still redacted? Share your thoughts on all of that and what all the other details in those files. Come on, I didn't even discuss all the other sites that were studied. So come on, Internet, have at it. Let's see what we find about this thing. But again, leave a comment, let me know your thoughts, but also let me mention I am going to Peru to see Machu Picchu and Cusco and other places this August. I'm going with the legendary Brian Forrester as well as Ben from Uncharted X. If you're interested in going on this trip, a few spots have opened up on the tour, so check out the link in the description. And I'm also going back to Egypt this October. I'm going with Brian Forrester, and I'll include the link. So all the details about this I'll share in my next video, just because for the sake of brevity, this is a long video. But hey, there's spots available, so if you want to come check out ancient Egypt and the pyramids with me and Brian Forrester and Peru with Ben, that's still a possibility. So check out the links down below. Let's see. I also have a Patreon I'm trying to get going, so thank you to everyone that's contributed to it in the past and is currently doing that. And then let me also give a shout out to the new Patreon followers, supporters, Miss Oblivion, Neil Roberts, History with Kaylee, you're awesome, Matt B, and Tree Lab. Thank you all so much for your support. I also have an Instagram. Follow me on there. I'm trying to grow that crap too. But what else? I guess I'll just close it up there. I'm Jimmy. My channel is called Bright Insight. I have many more exciting videos to come. I got some big ideas. Yeah, I've been missing in action, but life is good. I've been up to all kinds of interesting things. But help share this video. YouTube algorithms and all that crap, I don't want to get into it, but just share this stuff if you find it interesting, and at a minimum, it's a fun conversation. But with that said, I'll close it up here. I'm Jimmy. Channel's called Bright Insight. Like, comment, subscribe. Take care, everyone.